as part of your British induction, you know, if you come to this country, whether you're from Kansas or from a village in Afghanistan, you need to learn, like, okay, just so you know, bro, like in this country, you're going to see a woman shit-faced at 3 o'clock in the morning in a G-string walking down the street, and that's fine.
And you'll say, you're right, Ash.
And you'll also find out that you'll see at 5 in the morning a woman in full niqab walking down the street, and that's also okay, right? And so you need to learn, this is Britain. Yeah. This is who we are, okay? This is how we do it here. Both of those are scenarios you're going to encounter. And if you have a problem with that, this isn't going to be the place for you. There may be other places that are great, but like here, we kind of like the fact that both of those, and they might even be friends, right? That's Britain.
It's a podcast crossover event. If you haven't seen our next guest on her own show, The Tea, you've definitely seen her take on right-wingers and pro-Israel talking heads on your screens countless times. Today, I'm talking to Myriam François, and we're covering some familiar themes like the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the rise of the far right in the UK today. But we also go far beyond current affairs. We talk about what really drives her as a person, her journey to Islam, her politicization in Palestine, and whether or not she thinks anti-racist change is actually possible. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I enjoyed conducting it. See you on the other side. Myriam François, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks, Ash.
This feels like a crossover event between podcasts.
It does indeed, yeah. And hopefully you'll be on ours soon as well. So we'll literally be a crossover.
Yeah, you're going to be stuffing me into the boot of your car, like straight after this to make
That's
sure I
the
come and
plan.
think, oh my God, the steel in the days. So we're speaking on the week that the UK officially recognised the state of Palestine. Mm-hmm. How impactful, how meaningful do you think that is?
So first of all, I would start by saying that, you know, the Western recognition of Palestine is politically important for the PA in particular, the Palestinian Authority who govern Palestine. It's particularly important, I suppose, as a symbolic recognition of the long-standing claims of the Palestinian people. And in that sense, I don't ever want to demean what that recognition entails. You know, actually on my way here, I was watching a compilation of various political leaders, you know, announcing this recognition. And it was emotional, genuinely. I mean, of course, the video was designed to be emotional, but it was emotional to see, you know, the leaders of France, of Belgium, of Luxembourg. I even saw the Prince of Monaco, you know, recognizing it, which was the one that definitely made me think, yeah. And so I think we have to think about a couple of things, which is this recognition is obviously occurring in the midst of an ongoing genocide. And so to the extent that it's kind of purported to be in support of the Palestinian people, of their, you know, struggle for liberation, it's happening simultaneously with the full-on disintegration of what would effectively be the concrete delineation of a Palestinian state. So that's the complete ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which we know is happening before our eyes, but it's also the biggest expansion of settlements in the West Bank. It's the, militarization, increased militarization, I should say, of the area. I heard from Myriam François a few days ago that they've now closed the Allenby Bridge into the West Bank, which is the only way for Palestinians to get in and out of the territory. And, you know, my friends who live in East Jerusalem are living under siege. And so for all intents and purposes, yes, absolutely symbolically important, but what Palestinian state are we talking about at this point? When Israel continuously expands its borders, and we should state not just obviously in Palestine, in Palestinian land, but also now in Syrian land, in Lebanese territory. It's really not much more, I think, than an attempt to continue the facade of a two-state solution at a time where, let's be frank, there's been a monumental shift in public opinion with regards to support for Palestine, an awakening, if I may, in the Western world of the reality of the settler colonial state that is Israel. And, I think it's a recent statistic was saying 40% of young people don't even think Israel should exist. Again, that's 2 years on, from young people predominantly actually still supporting Israel. That says to me that there is an attempt today to salvage the idea of a two-state solution, which effectively is salvaging the Israeli state in its continuously expanding form as an apartheid state, which continues to implement structural racism in the form of actual apartheid within its non-delineated boundaries.
And just to say that the consensus position amongst human rights organizations is that it meets the legal definition of apartheid.
Right.
So we're not just talking about there are sort of thematic or psychological resonances between apartheid South Africa and Israel. What we're talking about is a legal system where you have one set of people, Palestinians living in the West Bank, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, Palestinians living in Gaza, who are subject to a totally different form of law,
yes,
totally different form of justice from Israel. So it's not just about racial discrimination, it's a legal system.
Right, it's a legal system. It's also been deemed such by, international human rights groups like Amnesty International, who obviously are studying the military rule, which applies to the Palestinians, which is a completely different system, as you point out, and one in which, the conviction rate in those courts is like 99%. So effectively, you are pretty much at any time that you're arrested, which for Palestinian men in particular, I believe is 1 in 3, likely to end up in prison. And also it's worth pointing out that once you enter the Israeli detention system, the likelihood is you get picked back up again. So that's also why you are seeing the detention of very young children. We have children in detention from the age of 12 onwards who are effectively kidnapped from their beds at night. I mean, think of it as a parent, like the Israeli army, breaks down your door at 2:00 in the morning, comes in, rips your child from their bed, takes them away. You don't know where they are. You don't have access to them. They don't have access to a lawyer. And they're taken into a system that has a long history of physical and sexual abuse of children and adults in that detention. I can't think of a greater nightmare personally as a parent myself than that situation. But to go back to the point, South Africans themselves who lived under apartheid and who visited the occupied territories say this is worse than the apartheid that they even lived under. So the idea that we will be returning to an apartheid state and an ongoing military occupation, but maybe version light, which I doubt, by the way, the recognition of Palestinian statehood has always, from the Western governments, been premised on the idea of not having any military capabilities. So no army, no navy, so no means to protect yourselves
from... It's a totally one-sided demilitarization.
Completely. And so to me, I don't understand why anyone would logically accept those terms. Now, that's not for me to decide. That's always for the Palestinians for themselves to decide what accommodations they will have to make with their reality. But I think that to become, for me, I feel like we're living through an era of, and again, maybe it's always been this of look this way, so you don't look this way. And there's so much of this happening. Trump is a master at it. We are continuously occupied by a literal circus designed to keep us preoccupied with false stories. And in the meantime, the real stories are constantly getting away.
We're going to come on to media culture in a second. But one of the things I'm really interested in is what was the pathway for your politicization when it came to Palestine? When did it happen? Why did it happen?
Thank you for that question. So I'm half French, half Irish. My mum, comes from a family that was always politically active on the Palestine issue. If you've ever been to the occupied north of Ireland, then you will know that the half of the population will fly an Irish flag alongside the Palestine flag, and others will flag a Republican, the UK flag alongside the Israeli flag. And so it's kind of built into the culture that there was a recognition of the parallels between the occupations and also parallels between perceptions of resistance. So my great-grandfather, great-grandfather was a member of the IRA who was killed by the Black and Tan, which was a paramilitary paramilitary group.
Who were also active in the British Mandate of Palestine.
Correct. So the parallels run deep. And for me, when I became a Muslim when I was 19, I kind of immediately went to Palestine as part of both a kind of desire to pray at Al-Quds, which is obviously, often described as the third holiest site in Islam, but it's also the first qibla, the first direction of prayer for us, as you well know. And it was also part of me wanting to express solidarity with the Palestinians at the time of the Second Intifada. And so that's what I did. I moved there. I lived there for just under a year. I worked for an organization in the West Bank whilst living in East Jerusalem in a beautiful place called Beit Hanina. And I was there on my own as a teenager. And I was taken in by the Palestinian community, who now those people are literally family to me. They're people I'm still in touch with who I will never, ever forget the things that we lived through together. And I'm not going to bore you with the entirety of my experience that year. And there's far worse things that happened to Palestinians. But there was enough that happened that I either bore witness to or that happened to me directly as someone at the time who wore hijab and jilbab and who was assumed to be Palestinian by the Israelis.
I mean, was there because I sort of remember, for me, it was Operation Cast Lead. That was when I became really politicized around it. And we talked about Palestine and, the ongoing ethnic cleansing a fair bit in my house, but it was sort of abstract to me. Do you know what I mean? It was sort of a bit abstract to me. And when people would talk about things like a two-state solution or a one-state solution, I was sort of a bit like, I could pick either one. It didn't feel like there were any real stakes until Operation Cast Lead. Did you have a similar journey where some things maybe felt abstract, or maybe you were more sympathetic to two-state arguments, or sympathetic even to some of the arguments made by liberal Zionists, and then something changed, you saw things, you witnessed things, and you emerged somewhere else?
I think I actually probably started before I went much more in the one state camp, in that there is a historic state of Palestine that was settled and colonized by, first and foremost European powers, and then handed over by those very same powers as a way to, address their anti-Semitism issue. I would say that my experience of living there actually transformed how I thought about many things, including the compromises that Palestinians are faced with in order to retain what they can. There are, political calculations that the leadership have to make with regards to the cards that are in front of them. And I learned a lot more about that on the ground than I did, theorizing about, it's a colonial state, it needs to be dismantled. Yes, but, what is the likelihood of us, and this is like 20 years ago, being able to achieve this versus, what are some of the gains that we may be able to get that won't be the full picture, but still allow us to dignity and to live. And remember that people have been living under occupation, brutal, violent, daily occupation. I mean, it's really hard to kind of translate what living under occupation looks like, because the violence is just present in every aspect of your life. You don't know if your kids are coming home from school. You don't know if your sick mum will be able to get to a hospital in time. If your wife is pregnant, she may not even be able to deliver in a hospital. She's held up at a checkpoint. There's every facet of your life is designed to make you want to leave. And, it's a testimony to Palestinian people's absolute, resilience and commitment to their land, profound connection to their land, that despite all of that, they refused to do it. I also should say that that was one of the first settings in which I met Jewish Israelis who were allies in the struggle. I met Jewish Israelis who their whole life had been told, never come to the West Bank, it's so dangerous, they all want to kill you, and literally would
That's what I was taught about South London.
But that might be true.
That might be true.
But certainly in these settings, people would be meeting in these small cafes or community centers in the West Bank, and you'd see someone edge through the door and just, a bit scared, and you'd be like, oh, we know, welcome, ahlan wa sahlan, like you're welcome to the meeting. And then just realizing that there were people in Israel who were also recognizing this and who were also identifying that there was a problem. And this is the crucial bit, not always clear on where they sat within the solution, right? Because, what are you going to say to that? But, you now need to leave. Like, that's what we would like you to do.
Yeah.
The best thing you can do is leave. And that's what I mean about learning what political pragmatism looks like.
I mean, it's hard because I feel... Okay, this is me talking in a moralistic sense rather than a strategic sense. And morals and strategy...
Completely separate.
Different things.
Yes.
But when I've spoken to Jewish friends of mine who have family connections in Israel, my moral feeling is, I don't think you should go there. Like, I think it's kind of fucked up for you to want to live in an apartheid society as the dominant class. Like, I understand you have family ties, and I understand that when family is involved, when love is involved, certain things are out the window. But I just think it's completely wrong that someone who, is of Jewish heritage from North London has a right to live in the land of historic Palestine, whereas someone who, was born in Nablus will have their movement limited for the entirety of their lives. Morally, that's how I feel. And I was talking about this with a friend of mine who was like, well, the sort of logical endpoint of your position is that there will never ever be an anti-occupation Jewish left in Israel, because what you're saying is that anyone who feels that way should stay in Europe or North America or wherever it happens to be. And that was the moment in having this conversation where someone did sort of put a challenge to my instinctive moral aversion to the idea of someone who is, Jewish and left-wing and dispositionally anti-occupation.
Right.
My moral position was like, well, I don't think you should go. Like, Did you ever have interactions like that?
Well, absolutely, because I went with a very clear anti-normalization position, which remains for me my default moral perspective, that I cannot see a justification unless you're under duress for engaging with a genocidal state that has been involved effectively in a slow genocide, ethnic cleansing of these people for, almost 80 years. What I learned on the ground was that it was valuable to us, to the Palestinians first and foremost, to have people who were, for example, when they were protesting, joining the protest as Israelis, standing at the front of those, being the ones to confront the soldiers in Hebrew as Jewish Israelis. Those were very valuable things I saw with my own eyes that Palestinians were benefiting from in those situations. So that, I don't want to say it confused the situation, because I also think that, to think of reality in kind of black and white terms is always to miss the, we all live in a gray zone. We're all in the gray zone. And the minute I hear too much leaning into black and white, I get a little like, ooh, I just...
It's also all right not to have a clear answer all the time. It's also okay.
Absolutely. And surely that's like the beauty of life, is like the further along you get to move. Of course, as women, we just expire. But really what I meant was that we do get the opportunity to revisit our ideals in different settings. And that helps us kind of develop maybe a more nuanced assessment of their application in, not just in principle, but in practice.
I want to move a little bit towards your journalistic work and also how that relates to the ongoing genocide in Gaza right now. I think that the first thing I ever saw you do was a 2015 documentary about Srebrenica. And it was, I think, the 20th anniversary of the Bosnian genocide. What stood out to you when you were putting this documentary together? And are there any parallels that you can see between, the genocide in Bosnia, what happened at Srebrenica, and what's happening now in Gaza?
I mean, I think Bosnians themselves have pointed out a lot of the parallels, right? They point out that genocide was occurring before the world's eyes. I mean, maybe not on social media, but there was an awareness of, the mass killings, the mass graves. I think that in making the documentary, there were so many things that stood out to me as, a European Muslim. It was first and foremost that many people within Europe itself didn't know that there'd been a genocide of a Muslim group because of their Muslimness, right? Let's be honest, like Bosnian Muslims were targeted as Muslims, and that this was a genocide in which these same communities had previously lived side by side. When I was in Bosnia, I'd meet people who'd say to me, I'd say to them, okay, so, in England, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on, this person's Christian, this person's Muslim, especially right now. And they said to me, oh, no, we didn't have that at all. Remember, we're coming off the back of communism where actually most people weren't that religious and we didn't really know who was what. And, my Christian neighbor would play with my, we're Muslim background family. We'd play together, intermarry. It genuinely wasn't something we even knew was a thing. And then the propaganda started. And the propaganda was all based around the demonization of Muslims as vermin, as scum, as, not worthy of the same rights, as cockroaches that needed exterminating. Language we're all seeing echoed here in this country right now.
Was there an argument that they sort of belonged to a different nation, that
Yes.
that they shouldn't be geographically where they are?
Yeah, the same way I, have been called a Saracen, and there were all
Wait, someone
kinds.
called you a Saracen?
Yes.
Were they from the fucking 1300s?
There are so many things we could unpick about.
It's gonna be like John of Gaunt heckling you from a car.
Honestly, I was just like, Saracens, what are you in this game? Should we just dress up and like have this out in a tournament? Because I feel like you just want to play a game. But of course, it's also all part of playing on the Crusader narrative, and which is a long-standing narrative pushed by the far right. In France, we've had it very kind of explicitly discussed for a long time. Most of my adult life, I've heard this notion of the need for Christendom to take back the land from the Muslims, which obviously did literally happen in France in history, but is not the situation now. And so to come back to your point, there was this idea that they were separated out by virtue of this religious identity as belonging to kind of the Turkic Ottoman legacy, which was then used on the as the justification to then demonize. And of course, genocide has many stages. So it starts with demonization, separation, and it goes all the way up, obviously, to extermination. And I think what was really shocking was the extent to which I felt that there were profound parallels in the kind of language I was already hearing back then about Muslims in Europe, but also the extent to which people weren't aware of this genocide. I had been raised myself on this idea of never again. And, I grew up with that very central to my own political identity. My grandparents in France would tell me stories of when the Nazis arrived and, they had to flee as children, and that people had to make a choice. Like, do you stay and collaborate, or do you head for the hills? And in France, we celebrate the tradition of the resistance, right? We literally celebrate the people who took up arms and headed to the hills and confronted those people, including our own government at the time, the Vichy government under Pétain, which was complicit, of course. And so I couldn't understand how this other genocide was not part of our narrative. It was another minority within Europe that was being exterminated. Why were we not kind of integrating that as part of our understanding of, like, we said never again, but it's kind of also happened again?
Why do you think that is? Because there is, as you point out, there's such a strong culture of memorialization around World War II. It's what you learn at school. You learn about the Holocaust at school, particularly growing up in Britain. The Battle of Britain is sort of the moment where we become a nation, right? That's our national origin story. Whereas for France, it might be the storming of the Bastille.
Absolutely,
and, for us, it's the Battle of Britain. It comes really late, our national origin story. But we've got this really strong culture of memorialization. But whenever you invoke never again for something contemporaneous, people say that's an insult to the Holocaust, that it's an insult to Jewish people living with the traumas of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. I'd refer back to one of my favorite authors and intellectuals, someone called Mahmoud Mamdani, who wrote a book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, which I highly recommend if people haven't read it. And he talks about a conversation that he had with a survivor of the Holocaust. And he said to him, I really want to understand what the lesson was that you learned from this horrific chapter in history. And the guy says to him, never again. And Mamdani walks away from the conversation and he says, I reflected on what he said and it lent itself to two possible interpretations. The first is never again to me and my people. The second is never again to anyone. And he says that between those two interpretations lies our common humanity. And that is literally where I would stand on that, which is that, we could go into the idea of the exceptionalism of the Holocaust, and I find it very distasteful to enter into, what do we call it, the Olympics, the oppression Olympics,
genocide top trumps.
Yeah, I can't. Horrific things were done to Jewish people in Europe. There is no doubt about that. It was also done to travelers. It was done to communists. It was done to disabled people. It was done to resistors. And surely the lesson there is about never again to our political opponents, never again to those that we think of as lesser, even if we think of them as lesser. And I say that even to ourselves, which is, something that, I take personally from my religion, which is much demonized, but to me, a key tenet of which is the idea that, and this is literally in the Quran. They love to cite the Quran in all different passages, but this one literally says, do not let the injustice of a people towards you lead you to injustice towards them.
Are you always good at holding on to that?
No, of course not. Of course not. I'm French. I'm passionate. I'm very and also I'm flawed and I'm imperfect and I'm contradictory in a million different ways, which we could get into. But I also, that is still the core of what I believe. And I love the fact that even if I am, defaulting on that principle, if you say it to me in that moment, I will catch it. I will catch it because it's what I believe. It's not always what I do. And by the way, newsflash, there's loads of things that I know I shouldn't do that I do. Just putting it out there.
See, my Jiminy Cricket is my husband. And so whenever I'm like, no, really fucking hate this person or this thing, he'll be like, well, why don't you see it from their perspective? I'm like, who asked you? Who asked you?
Yeah.
Are you that lawyer?
Right.
Like, please join me in being a horrible person. Don't try and pull me out the mud. I'm happy in the mud. I love it here.
Yeah. I mean, it's always difficult when you're in that moment to step outside of it. But certainly long term, I feel that even with people that I profoundly disagree with, again, sorry to proselytize here, but for me, there is a religious dimension to it, which is the sacredness of all human life. Like there is no human that is lesser human. Like God created all the souls. Like who am I to be like, you're a lesser soul?
Even Arsenal supporters.
Yeah, indeed.
Even. I mean, I want to move on just a little bit to some, I guess, really current affairs.
Yeah.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog visited the UK recently. He met with Keir Starmer. And what was interesting to me about that visit is that it was met with beefed up rhetoric from the Labour Party frontbench. So you had Wes Streeting telling Times Radio that Herzog, quote, needs to answer the allegations of war crimes, of ethnic cleansing and of genocide that are being levelled at the government of Israel. What did you make of that contrast? Like, on the one hand, Herzog is coming here. He doesn't have to worry about facing arrest for those allegations of war crimes because the UK isn't going to,
apply the warrant.
Apply a warrant in that way. But you've got this much stronger rhetoric than anything we've heard from Labour over the past couple of years. What did you make of that contrast?
I mean, isn't it just what we've heard for the last 2 years in many ways, right? Which is on one hand, a very meager offering to the overwhelming majority of people in this country who want to see an end to the genocide and sanctions and an end to British collusion in these atrocities, sort of the very meager offering of, we don't think this is very nice. Yeah, you shouldn't really be doing it. But you can still come here
and be into bed without supper.
Right, but even not without, but they're still given supper, and that's the freaking point, right? It's like they're still getting the arms, they're still getting the surveillance flights, intel that we're offering them, including, if you look at the fantastic work that Matt Kennard and his colleagues have done around this, it's very clear that, the RAF in particular are not a neutral party in the ongoing genocide. And so to the extent that I referred earlier to this notion of the circus, right, of, look over here at what we're doing so you don't look over here, I feel that it fits into that pattern of we're going to, maintain some level of facade around what we know are international obligations. Our lawyers are advising us that, since, of course, what the UN has said, this does have implications for our standing. It has legal implications. But also Israel continues predominantly, I would say, by virtue of our subservience to the US empire, require us to follow their lead. And so until the UK realizes that this country today is colonized by America, it is a vassal of the US state, that it's also not a particularly respected vassal. Very interesting to me when I see Trump, patting Keir Starmer on the back, like, good boy, well done for reading out your notes so well. And you're just like, oh, dear God. Or interrupting him, when he doesn't like him. I mean, this is like the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but like, who cares, right? So I do just think at this point, many of us feel like the Palestine issue has awoken us to the reality of a political class that is, no longer responsive to the democratic mechanisms. And, Palestine is not the first time that we realize this. I think if you look at the state of the economic state of this country, it's very apparent that most people want, improvements in their standard of living, improvements in healthcare. They want to be able to afford a home. They want to not die because the waiting lists are so long. And yet there's literally no reflection of those basic needs, even from a government that claims its legitimacy through its association to labor movements. And so to the extent that, as a woman, I firmly believe in looking at what someone does and not what they say, useful relationship advice, I think that also applies to our political class, which is I'm not as interested in the spin, which has been operational for many decades, as I am in what actually matches up between what you're saying is an issue and the actions you're taking to address that.
I mean, I feel I know how you're going to respond to this, but I'm going to play devil's avocado.
Do it.
One area in which the UK has diverged from the US on a substantive foreign policy issue is the recognition of the state of Palestine. So does that then imply that actually there's a little bit of steel in Keir Starmer's spine? Is it because the recognition of the state of Palestine is relatively cost-free and that there are actually more important things he could be doing, but he's not doing that? Like, how do you make sense of that?
I make sense of it on multiple fronts, but the first is that, I would first probably start by saying that Palestinians will, benefit at some level from this legal recognition of their state. But of course, the West is now joining the vast majority of the world that has long recognized Palestinian statehood. And if we, step out of our Western bubble, where we obviously think everything revolves around the decisions that happen here, there are ongoing discussions in other parts of the world around how, a kind of peace process that could be led by different parties might propose different solutions. And I say that in that there's been a long-standing attachment from the US and Western powers to this notion of a two-state solution as the solution, even though in practice they have permitted the gradual and increasingly rapid eradication of the territorial basis for that. And for that, I just want to point out some things for maybe people who aren't as familiar with Palestine. There was a time not that long ago that people in the West Bank could travel to Gaza. For the last over 10, 15 years, that's no longer an option. If you're in the West Bank, you can't get to Gaza. It's very difficult for you to get to East Jerusalem. There are entire cities in the West Bank which are surrounded by the wall. You know, we talk about the separation wall, or we don't actually anymore. It's just like, oh, that thing that happened, you know, oh, that illegal wall that has basically been used to, undertake huge land grabs that are illegal under international law. Yes, that wall literally encircles entire towns in the West Bank where you have to go through an Israeli checkpoint to come out of your town, to go to another town, let's say for work. You know, when I was in Tulkarem, I remember they closed it. Men who were returning for work couldn't get back home. You know, that's what you're talking about. And so I again, back to this idea of like, I believe what you do, not what you say. Your commitment to the Palestinian state, which is premised on the notion of two-state solution, is undermined by the reality that you've allowed to progress on the ground. There are two ways to read that. One is that our leaders are politically inconsistent, which they are. And of course, history is often best understood by a series of blunders by people rather than sort of some grand master plan that they effectively executed. But I also think that there is a concerted effort to maintain this notion of a two-state solution as the desirable solution, which will ultimately result in, this is my personal prediction, an expanded Israel and a series of self-governing-ish Bandustans across the West Bank, which will have no authority really beyond policing their own people the way that the PA currently does the resistance in the West Bank, or their ability to travel, to protect themselves, to actually be a state. So when we say a two-state solution, what state are we actually talking about? Because I don't think it's a state in the same way that we talk about the state of Israel.
But also, it's not a state that we would accept for ourselves. Like, as the UK, we wouldn't accept, okay, France gets an army and nukes and a navy and an air force, and we don't get any of those things. Like, I don't think we'd accept that. And we also wouldn't accept a non-contiguous state. I mean, speaking as someone who's Bengali, we had a go at a non-contiguous state. It was called East Pakistan. It went very, very badly.
This doesn't make sense. How are the people going to get to each other's place? I mean, at one point they were floating this idea of a tunnel. It was like, Palestinians will go through a tunnel.
Like moles.
Yeah, like moles, but also because you just don't want to see them because, no. Ultimately, I think we have such ample evidence today of how profoundly sick Israeli society is. And it's not sick because, Israeli Jews are somehow inherently bad people. Of course they're not. They are people. They have just been indoctrinated profoundly into the notion of supremacy, into Jewish supremacy. There's white supremacy, there's Jewish supremacy, there are many forms of supremacy. For some reason, we struggle to call this one what it is.
I'm going to pretend for a minute to be Jake Wallace-Simons.
Oh, dear God.
I'm going to pretend to be Jake Wallace-Simons because something that he says is that the problem fundamentally is Islam. The problem is Islam, that Muslims see the state of Israel as an insult to, what was once a great Islamic empire, and that Muslims use the Palestinian people as sort of a totem for what their actual ambitions are, which is, something close to world domination, or at least Islamic expansionism.
Who's leading this Islamic expansionism? Which Muslim state has entered into or aggressed any other? Can we have some evidence that there's a massive expansion of Islam, as if, because I get this all the time. I literally had somebody comment on a post recently who was like, Islam's trying to take over the world. And I was just like, Islam is an idea, is trying to take over the world. Okay. With all due respect, the land of Palestine obviously historically was under the Ottoman Empire, the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was the last Islamic empire, which was essentially dismantled by Western colonial powers at the beginning of the 20th century. And that followed a long-standing, obviously, campaign to essentially pull the empire apart from inside, because the Ottoman Empire was historically the big contender for, control of the world. Just as, Western colonial powers expanded and wanted to take control of different lands and different peoples, there was already an empire in place in those spaces. So there was an inherent competition, absolutely historically, between those two empires. Now, within those empires, there were people of all religious traditions, and probably none. We didn't hear much from those ones, but I'm sure they were there too. And that included Jewish people. And those Jewish people were, often integral parts of, forms of governance within the empire, including impositions of power. And so this idea that it's Islam versus the Jews is fundamentally nonsensical.
Well, they'd say Islam versus Judeo-Christianity, right?
Yeah.
So they sort of lump those two together.
They love to lump them together. And what's ironic about that is that I regularly pose this wager to people and say, you tell me what it is that Judaism and Christianity share that Islam doesn't share with them. Because I can tell you what Islam and Christianity share that Judaism doesn't share with them.
I mean, Jesus
would be a big one.
That's a big one.
And years ago, I was when I was doing my master's in the US, there was a big event on our campus, and at the time George W. Bush was in power, and he had organized a huge interfaith gathering, and he'd excluded any Muslim leadership. So there was all the Christian denominations, several different Jewish representations, and not a single Muslim representative. And so the imam of my university at the time, which was Georgetown, went to him and said, I was just wondering, why we hadn't been asked to maybe say a few words. And he, George Bush at the time says, it's because, America is a Judeo-Christian civilization. And
so it was supposed to be separation of church and state, but fine, whatever.
We should come back to that. And so he says to him, the imam says to him, okay, pray tell me, Mr. President, what it is that Jews and Christians share that we Muslims don't share with them. And George W. Bush, with a straight face, says, Jesus Christ. I wish it was a joke. I wish it was a joke. So we're often dealing with, a level of such intense Islamophobia that has, been decades in the making and has largely been funded and fueled, in fact, by Israel. And that needs to be pointed out. When I was studying in America, doing my master's, a lot of what was being pushed out along this narrative of Islam's an existential threat to the West was coming from either pro-Israel or actual Israeli organizations, think tanks. And so,
like which ones?
So Mary would be one of them. Daniel Pipes, what's our guy who wrote Bernard Lewis. So these are all people who continue to advocate for this notion that Israel is the bulwark for the West. It's the front line of this Western battle against, Islam. When in reality, if we look at the facts, which countries have been the single most guilty of territorial expansion, aggression, invasions, mass murder? I mean, America tops the list by a long shot. So I do think it's interesting to consider this narrative in context of an empire that spends a considerable amount of time in branding, right? And for a long time, that branding was actually really good. Many of us bought into it. It was like the land of the free and the brave. I went to study in America. They want to promote democracy in the Middle East. Okay, they didn't do it that well in Iraq, but, that's what they're committed to. At least now it's barefaced. Yeah. At least now it's barefaced. You don't care about democracy. You don't care about human rights. You just care about the expansion of the empire's interests. At least we know. We know. It's better. It's better.
I want to move on a little bit because you've talked about the centrality of Islam to your worldview, your politics, your system of values. What was your journey to Islam like?
Ash, what they call someone who mixes politics and Islam, right? Dirty Islamists. Jihadi Barbie is out here promoting.
Before the cameras went live, Myriam told me that a label for you is Jihadi Barbie. And I thought, I'd buy that if it was an embroidered cap.
Coming soon in personalized merch. Yes.
This Barbie is a jihadi.
Right. I'm very offended with the idea that I should be in any way compared to Barbie. That's all I have to say on that matter. I became a Muslim when I was 19. I have to point out at this point that I did grow up with a lot of Muslims. My background is French. I went to French school. It was not strange to me. I say that because I think a lot of people sort of think of becoming Muslim as such a huge step away from what they know because of how we represent Islam as being so foreign and different and strange. But for me, having grown up with a lot of Muslims in my close friendship group, and in a country that has one of the largest proportions of Muslims in Europe, for me, it was just part of who we are. We are like, Islam is a French religion today. It's part of the tapestry of who we are. Now, we're a secular state in France, but in terms of the religions, Islam is one of the main religions in France. So, okay, I knew we were hostile to them in many ways, and we could do a whole other episode on the intensity of French Islamophobia. But for the intents and purposes of this question, I was always kind of, I would say, respectful from a distance. I was a lapsed Catholic. I, refused to believe in the idea that the Pope was, the, infallible representation of God's word on earth. I was like, I'm sure he's very spiritual, but that's just a step too far. Like, I can't, that bit, but love good people. And so, again, no shade on Catholics or Christianity. There are members of my family who are nuns in Ireland.
Do you feel informed by Catholicism in any way? Because one of the things that I feel is that because I've obviously grown up in such a Christian culture and I studied English literature, and one of the things, I'm so glad they made us do this, they made you read your King James Bible. And so many of my cultural touchstones, I'm drawing from Christianity. I mean, do you feel like, oh, okay, Islam is my religion and it's the sort of, the main well from which I draw my ideas and my principles, but I grew up in a very Christian culture as well, and I can feel the influence.
Of course. So, that many people will be familiar with the Palestinian powerhouse intellectual, Edward Said, God rest his soul. Edward Said was a Palestinian Christian, but he would say he was religiously Christian, but culturally Muslim. I would say that I am religiously Muslim, but culturally Christian because of what you've just pointed out, which is we do live in a society that's very much informed by, the Christian religion. I think I might also just contest a little bit the idea that is often kind of put on me that to go from Christianity to Islam is a huge leap, or that it involves a rejection of something. I never experienced it that way. I felt that what I learned about Islam confirmed everything that I already believed about previous messages, whether that was in the Torah or in the Bible, and then just expanded it. And so I never understood where people were like, you abandoned your religion, or you rejected your culture. And I'm like, I just really didn't. I feel like you don't get what Islam actually is. You're just projecting onto me the idea that I've adopted something foreign and hostile. But actually, what is Islam's real message? It's a confirmation of the messages that the prophets of Christianity and Judaism brought, and of monotheistic Abrahamic principles. So I'm so confused when people say to me like, oh my God, you left it all or you rejected it. And I'm just like, I understand that's your imposition onto me of what you think I've done. It's just not my experience of what I've been through.
I mean, something we have in common is we're both Muslim. Though I suspect that you are much more of a student of theology and scripture than I am, all right?
I'm a geek. I like reading. I'm sure you are too, yeah.
I'm in it for the ED money, all right?
Fine.
Okay, I'm just going to put that out there now. I'm in it for the ED. One of the things which I've been thinking about a lot recently is that I sometimes feel really caught between an Islamophobic context and there being some real systemic issues around patriarchy and misogyny. And one of the things which I see amongst not all, but many Muslim men is this, what I call a really rigid good girl, bad girl distinction. So the good girl is the one who wears hijab at least, doesn't interact with any men outside her own family, certainly has no friendships with boys or with men. Her movement and her social life is quite small. And the bad girl is anyone who you know diverts from those things.
Yeah.
And it's so extreme. It's, well, if you're friends with a boy, and I grew up with people who were in this sort of situation, if they were friends with a boy,
Yeah.
be like, well, you're a whore.
Yeah.
And I find it really difficult to work out, how can I talk openly about these things in a way which doesn't reinforce, a really violent form of Islamophobia, which doesn't liberate the girls I'm talking about either. Like, how do you thread that needle?
So I have to, obviously, cards on table, like there are many differences in which we are different in our Muslim identity. Is that, first of all, you can never escape yours. You're always right. And this is the point, is that most Muslims are racialized as Muslim, and I'm not. And I have to kind of flag that, because I do think it changes my experience. And I certainly can see the difference between when I wore hijab day to day and when I don't. There was a lot of violence that I experienced as a muhajaba, as a woman who wore hijab. And it affected me profoundly, actually. What you're alluding to is that, obviously, within our own community, there are multiple cultural interpretations of our faith. And when you come to the faith from a non-Muslim culture, so although I'm religiously Muslim, my culture is, British, French, Irish, European, you sort of have your own take, in a way. And I think that's true for many European Muslims. The practice that you have, that I have, that my friends have, is different to their parents who grew up in Algeria or who grew up in Morocco. And that doesn't mean that what their parents did was bad. It was what was fitting to their context. We're in a different context. What we are lacking in many ways, partly due to the very deliberate colonial strategy of eradicating our centers of Islamic learning, which were dynamic centers of Islamic learning, which were dynamic in that the faith is not static, it is not fixed. People always say to me, the Sharia says this. And I'm like, no, okay, dear God, let's just have a minute. Think of Sharia as like a set of ideas up here, and then think of reality here. And then it's our job right here in the middle to think about how these ideals connect to reality. And obviously, reality shifting means that it's never going to be exactly the same thing. So can we just take a second also to understand that to Muslims, Sharia means a path to water, which sounds like a nice thing, like probably like a little cooling, refreshing, So this perception that we're constantly dealing with means that our communities are often feeling like it's very difficult for us to raise our dirty laundry, because it is, as you say, weaponized against us. I try and navigate that in multiple ways. One is by consistently raising those issues within internal settings. So, I'm sure that if we had, a number of different Muslim organizations here, they would tell you, like, it's probably annoying that I'm the person also consistently raising it. But I raise it in the context that I think it's a symptom of a wider issue. It's a symptom of, why do certain communities end up rolling inwards rather than expanding outwards. When you start to recoil on yourself and, become scared of everything, and you have to protect your women, which isn't always protection, it's actually quite harmful.
Control.
Yeah, exactly. And I completely concur. But where's it coming from, right? It's coming from this fear that everything in the external world is going to, either damage them or take them off the path.
But that's not just to do with Islamophobia, though, is it? I mean, sometimes it's from a village context with
Absolutely.
like a very low level of education, very low level of autonomy for women.
Yeah.
For economic reasons, emigrating to countries like the UK.
Yeah.
Where I'm not saying that everything about our sexual culture is good. It's not even feminist. It's like a lot of it is deeply misogynist in a completely different way.
Yeah.
But some of it is about this sense of, okay, well, I've got to replicate, what it is like to live in a sort of hyper-surveilled village context in Edmonton or
Right.
in Ilford or
Yeah.
in Tower Hamlets.
But I guess, so there's a class issue that obviously is clear in that context, and it's clear in, the reason I was sort of alluding to the historical institutions of learning is because what's then happened is that the transmission of religious knowledge has been handed down in many of our Muslim majority countries to essentially the people who couldn't do well in mainstream education. So in a lot of Muslim majority countries, there's mainstream education that takes you into like secular careers. And then if you don't do really well at that, you go to madrasa. And so who do you end up having coming out of the madrasas? People who are not able or don't have access to secular education, which is the route to economic, social mobility, to economic growth. And I think that you can't tie, you can't fully disassociate, the idea of, a lack of literacy with the dominant culture from the inability to then find solutions that marry your intellectual, religious, ideological outlook to the realities of the community. I mean, the best example I always give of this beyond women is like, when we talk about drugs in the Muslim community, like, it's like, Muslims don't take drugs. And I'm like, oh, right.
Oh,
Okay. Well, let's just start there. Or Muslims don't drink, and it's like, I understand that you're coming from a context.
I've never seen anyone who loves Johnny Walker more than a Bengali man. Like, for real.
It's just, but we hear this, right? And it's, even I remember at one point the law may have changed in Morocco, but in Morocco, they didn't used to breathalyze people that were stopped because the assumption was if you're a Muslim, you're not drinking, And indeed. So what I'm getting at is a lot of what we're talking about are like the need to adapt religious principles and ideas to modern realities. And when you kill the institutions that are capable of doing that, when you kill the notion that academic excellence is also tied to theological brilliance, which of course we find in all of our greats, the Al-Ghazalis, the Ibn Sinas, right? These are people who marry like profound understanding of philosophy, medicine,
Also, critical
chemistry.
interrogation is such an important part of the Islamic tradition. And the idea that you're supposed to read outside of your faith and read beyond your faith.
Yeah. And so that's it, right? So then you're asking people who are coming from settings where they've understood their mission is to come to England and to preserve, this faith. And this is, and they may have heard different things about the culture before they came. I think that what we're really lacking is an investment in the institutions. And this goes far beyond the Muslim community, right? It's something at the community level. You could extend it to youth clubs. You could extend it to kind of the roles that are kind of la mairie. What do you say that in English? Where do you do the local politics in the...
Twitter. No.
Before the real world one, the people get married there.
Oh, yeah.
What is it called?
Civic centres.
Right. So we're losing all of these spaces. And these are spaces where like people who think like that will come with people like that, think like that. And we discuss and we debate and we find other ways of being. We've lost so many of these spaces. And so most people now are just going online. They don't have people who are connected to their realities. So, it is a challenge. I personally make a point. I was speaking at a school. I was invited actually to speak at a school that was doing incredibly well. It's an Islamic school in Bradford. It's an all-girls school. And the girls are doing, mashallah, brilliantly. And I was so proud to be part of this opening, not least because of what's always, said about Bradford. And the perceptions that people have. And to give you an indication, before I spoke, I hope they won't mind me saying this, one of the leaders at the school said to me, we have a lot of very conservative parents here. Many of them come from Pashtun backgrounds, and their daughters have now achieved all A's in their A-levels, and they want to go to university, but they're scared to let their daughters go to university because of what might happen there.
And so this is the thing which I find so frustrating, is that the what might happen is almost always to do with sex.
Okay, so
do you know what I mean? It's so...
For sure. And so I said to one of the Pashtun fathers, very respectfully, because, he's I'm sure not a bad person. I know he cares about his daughter, but it's not quite materializing how she needs. I said to him, there's this principle that sometimes what we fear in others is what we fear in ourselves. And I just want you to think about that for a second when you tell me that you're worried about your daughter going to university. What are you actually worried she's going to do? Because maybe that's just what you would do.
But this comes back to the good girl, bad girl thing. And, this is something which it's nice to have this conversation with someone. And it's nice to be able to have it openly because I feel so curtailed, right? When I've had those experiences where I've gone to shake a Muslim man's hand, he's like, sorry, I won't. Is that obviously I'm not going to be like, give me your wrist. Or I'm like, fine. But what I hate about it is that it reinforces what I think is an essential tenet of misogyny, which is that any interaction between a woman and a man is sexual, that a woman's body is inherently sexualized, and that there's no platonic interaction that can occur, and that something like physical touch, something like a handshake, something like your daughter going to university, it's seen so through a sexualized lens. And I think this brings me to various forms of veiling, which is it means different things to different women.
Absolutely.
And for lots of Muslim women, they say, no, what I want is to have this outward sign of my faith that I carry with me all the time. And this isn't to do with men and this isn't to do with sex. Right. What I also think is undeniable, though, is that many of the origins of the ideas around it, right? There's a reason why it's women's bodies who are covered in a particular way, and men avert their gaze from women, but men don't have to worry about women's gaze on them. I don't have to worry about it.
They do. The Quran tells both men and women.
But culturally, that's not the part which has been
agreed.
That's not the part which has been taken up.
Yeah,
is that I find it. Again, it's about threading a needle, right? How can you make room for the nuance and all the different ways in which women feel about hijab, feel about veiling, while also at the same time rejecting this idea that a woman's body is defined by sex?
Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't that kind of the issue that we're fighting across all cultures?
Yes.
Right? I mean, if you go to Brazil, where, people... I want to say do the opposite of veiling. It's a very sexually open culture, and certainly in how people dress. Women are still first and foremost being interpreted, being interacted with on the basis of kind of a sexual perception of their identity. And look.
I mean, I think our porn-saturated culture is also, that's the message that you get from all pornography. And so I'm saying that this is why it's a tenet of misogyny, right? Misogyny is in every culture.
But I guess I've always thought of the way that Islam encourages modesty, which I'm also not always guilty of, guilty of not always respecting even by my own principles of it, is the idea that in the public arena, because of course Islam makes a huge difference between the public and private arena. In the public arena, you are asked as both men and women to adhere to a modest outlook. And the idea is that when we're interacting in the public arena, can we just focus on what we came here to do, which is, hopefully improve society, help people, create a better world together, and not let the things that can sometimes come into that interaction become the salient or predominant basis for our interaction. I see value in that. What I don't see the necessity of is to define it over and above that society's consensus, ijma' in Arabic, right? The ijma' is in Islam is the basis for understanding the consensual understanding of the rulings. And if you live in a society where the consensus around modesty is different, do you yourself need to kind of think about, well, it's absolutely fine if you want to take a more conservative, and I don't have no issue with it. I was talking to Taj Ali the other day, and I was like, I feel like there should be, as part of your British induction, if you come to this country, whether you're from Kansas or from a village in Afghanistan, you need to learn, like, okay, just so you know, bro, like in this country, you're going to see a woman shit-faced at 3:00 in the morning in a G-string walking down the street. And that's fine.
And you'll say, you're right, Ash.
And you'll also find out that you'll see at 5 a.m. a woman in full niqab walking down the street, and that's also okay, right? And so you need to learn, this is Britain. Yeah. This is who we are, okay? This is how we do it here. Both of those are scenarios you're going to encounter. And if you have a problem with that, this isn't going to be the place for you. There may be other places that are great, but like here, we kind of like the fact that both of those women, and they might even be friends, right? That's Britain.
Also, she might be the same woman on different days.
She may be the same women on, absolutely. And that's another side of the community because of there being so much negative scrutiny that, you know, there's a sort of reified understanding of what a Muslim is and what a Muslim woman is and why she wears things and why she doesn't wear things. And, you know, people regularly say to me like, oh, are you still Muslim? Why? Because I don't wear hijab. Are we serious right now?
Come on.
I mean, at this point...
but this is the thing, the good girl and the bad girl is the same girl,
of course,
right? And this is what that's what feminism is about.
But also that's, to me, the story of our faith is the story of always going towards the marginalized, always going towards the people who are, you know, set aside as society as, you know, the lepers, the poor, the politically not expedient, you know, those are the people that we stand with, the meek, the woman who is cleaning the mosque floor and everyone's rushing towards, you know, the people in authority who are there, and the prophet peace be upon him saying, no, this woman will probably get to paradise before all of you, you know? And for me, that's kind of what Islam means. It's like, you know, I can't make assumptions about anyone here because in reality, there is something unique to each of us in our relationship to the divine. Some people don't even call it God, that I have zero insight from and cannot possibly be in a position to make a judgment on just by looking at you.
I mean, and also to say that, like, these things that I'm wrestling with and how it plays out within Muslim communities is that, so my family, everybody has had a mixed marriage by either race, religion, or both, right? We just want all the cuisines. We were like, yep, having that.
Very London.
It's very London. And, you know, my mum was in a mixed marriage with a Hindu. That's my father. Then with a Church of England raised atheist, that's my stepdad. My sister married to a Hindu. And these stories about the good girl and the bad girl, the good woman and the bad woman, the lucky woman and the unlucky woman, I've seen that play out in literally every single one of these cultures.
Yeah, of course.
Like every single one.
We have it in mainstream secular culture in Britain, right? There is still a version of what the good girl is, and she's definitely not the girl who's in care, 14 years old, hanging out by taxi stands and being abused by, you know, grooming gangs. Like, she's not the good girl, because if she was, you would have taken better care of her and we would have ensured that the services in place were there to protect her.
I mean, so this is one of the things which I think has been really missing from the grooming gang story. And the thing is that I'm also open to understanding it culturally. But the thing that no one wants to admit is that where you have child sexual exploitation in other parts of the country and the offenders are majority white, no one wants to then understand that through a cultural lens.
No.
Right? So I'm open to understanding it culturally, but no one wants to do that where the offenders are white. But my mum, before she retired, was in child protection, right, for her whole career. And one of the things that she said she came up against time and again is that when you had girls who were in care or girls who were subject to what's called a child protection plan, looked after children, and they were being sexually exploited, the attitude from the police was, well, they're making consensual choices. Now, obviously, the principle in law is that you can't consent, right?
Yes.
That's the law of the land, is that you can't consent under the age of 16. You know, obviously, if it's, you know, a relationship of two 15-year-olds, you might go, all right, let's not throw them in jail. Fine. Yeah. But when you're talking about 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old and older men, the law exists that you can't consent. But the attitude, and this was also a big thing during the Chavs era. So the Chavs moral panic, Vicky Pollard, all of this was, these are, you know, chavvy slags. Like, that's how children who are victims of abuse were being talked about. And that is the facet of the story that we never examine, was how these girls were unprotected. not because of multiculturalism, but because of what the dominant culture was saying about them and their sexual morality.
Absolutely. And there was no willingness to engage with what you've just talked about, which is the cultural cauldron that facilitated the representation of these young girls as inherently, overtly sexual or, whatever all the terminology. I don't even want to repeat it that's used to describe these girls. But I do find it very interesting that, we talk a lot currently, especially about this idea of like protect the girls. And I just want to know what injection of money these people are calling for to be put into the very services which are being cut constantly. If you know people, and your mum was in the care system, but I also know many people in the care system who either went through it themselves or who work in it now. They're paid minimum wage. They are very rarely trained, that I can see, to deal with horrendously complex situations. And, it doesn't make sense to me to say that you care about vulnerable young people and to, for example, privatize the systems of care that they
let
are
private
going
equity
into.
run these children homes.
Yeah. And we all know that private equity run anything is therefore in the best interest of the young people in the homes, right?
Great.
We don't like. It's again, I think, earlier on we were talking about the kind of the Palestine awakening. I think that we're at such a point now, at such a late stage of capitalism, that it's clear that in every single facet of our lives, the adage of profit over people is reflected in such an extreme way that it's leading many people, I would say, to extreme solutions. And one of them is reflected in the adherence to, for me at least, ideologically defunct forms of, racial supremacy as a way to maintain a sort of sense of your own supremacy in a society that's crumbling economically first and foremost, and in which you continue to think that you should be entitled, but don't recognize that the people who are demoting you from being entitled are not those arriving on the boats fleeing whatever, but the ones at the top who are just like, you're just a bit of a waste of space, and we're really focused on like colonizing Mars and becoming sort of tech hybrid humans.
Yeah, I'm trying to put a Neuralink in a monkey right now.
Yeah,
so sorry.
You're just like, we don't need to be putting money in you people. You waste. But when you are useful is when we need to have a demonstration in the center of London to show the Palestine movement that we still control these streets.
Let's talk about this. Like, let's talk about the sort of I guess this what can feel like a tidal wave of right-wing populism, both here in the UK, of course, in the US as well. Should we be fighting, and by we I'm meaning it in its broadest possible sense, people who believe that a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy is good? Should we be fighting to say, no, we get to decide what England is, we get to decide what Britishness is? Or should we abandon the flag? I mean, where do you stand on that?
Specifically on the flag, I mean, I would never wave a British flag. That's down to my Irishness and nothing else. You'll never, ever see me do that. Do I object to other people doing it? No. Do I wave the French flag? Yes.
Mais oui.
Absolument. And that's also because I do think we have a different relationship to those symbols, even in France. So in England, I have always understood culturally that if I walk down a street and I see the St. George's flag in particular, that it's it's a shorthand to let me know that you are probably adherent to kind of BNP, sort of EDL, kind of that perspective. Like, that's how I'm understanding the symbol. And again, maybe I'm just ignorant, but that's kind of what it's been translated as by the communities who've experienced violence with people kind of carrying the flag. The Union Jack, to me, is an imperial flag by virtue of my identity. But certainly British people should be reclaiming it in the way that, this is your culture, this is your country, this is, your history. Like, I say yours only because, like, I think schooling is so important. I studied in a French school, so I only study French history. And of course, we always learn, you guys are over there.
See, whereas I'm like, Agincourt, remember Agincourt.
I'm just...
Our longbows.
People tell me stuff about British history all the time, and I'm like, this is common knowledge. And they're like, how do you... And I'm like,
Well, the thing is that it's the bits that we emphasize and de-emphasize. So one of the things which I found hilarious is that the Battle of Lepanto is obviously this huge moment in European history. It's when, the navies of Christendom, they come together to defeat the Ottoman Turk. In Turkey, they're like, oh yeah, we rebuilt our navy super quick after that. Don't worry about it. Like, not a big deal.
Right. And so important to hear those different perspectives. I think the biggest thing that scares me about this current moment, apart from the fact that most civilizations historically flourish most when they have an ebullition of cultural interactions.
What's ebullition?
Like like a bubbling.
Oh, like a bubbling pot.
Yeah, like a bubbling pot, like people interacting and sharing. And, these are the moments you can actually trace through different empires as being moments of growth, periods of intellectual exchange. And that we are regressing in this country to this idea that everything foreign is bad. And I think it's first and foremost not self-serving. I think it's defeating of, if you want to make Britain great again, it's probably not going to be by going backwards. It's always going to be by like looking at what we can borrow and take and, expand on. And there are people from different parts of the world who bring all kinds of amazing new ways of thinking and doing. And so you want to kind of lose all of that. So there's a sort of fallback on this idea that then reflects in, I think, a form of cultural status, as not status, status, I should say, from cultural status. That is only going to harm this country long term. Cultures are always in evolution. When I'm speaking in France, for example, and people say, the Muslim cultures, that, they're changing the nature of France. And I'm like, I would like to refer you back to the moral panics that we had over the Italian invasions in our history. Like, we literally had moral panics about Italians. The Italians are coming over. They're, too much practicing Catholics. We're a secular country. Like, they are taking over. They're taking our jobs. They're taking our women. Like, exactly the same discourse. Today, Nicolas Sarkozy, former French president, right, is of Italian heritage. No one is sort of suggesting that Sarkozy is not really French.
The Italianate takeover.
Right.
Playing the long game.
Although you could, right?
Yeah.
Based on the long game. But, and so I sort of see these moral panics around foreignness as being harmful to the country, first and foremost, obviously, economically, intellectually, culturally. I can say this as a European, the appeal of London, the appeal of the UK for many Europeans was the mishmash cultures that you found here. It was these exchanges that you found. This idea now of the supremacy of one culture and that, you have to sort of kiss the throne, it's not going to work. People have options. The world is big. There's lots of other centers that people who are smart and have money can head to.
But is this maybe the difference between multiculturalism and, something more like, multi-ethnic democracy? And the reason why I say that is because multiculturalism sort of presumes they have lots of cultures, but they don't really change one another, right? And
is that the idea?
I think that is part of the vision of it, right? And there is also a sort of colonial model of multiculturalism, which Tony Blair quite liked, which was like, bring to me your big chief and I shall negotiate with him.
Oh, yes, right.
And that's how you end up with, when anything bad happens and you get leader of the Muslim community and you're like, this is the first time I'm seeing this guy.
Absolutely.
Like, who's he? Yeah. And it's because of this sort of, I think it is a colonial model of multiculturalism of sort of like managing, native populations by being like, okay, you will have your hierarchies, you sort them out amongst yourselves, and then I will negotiate with them.
Yeah.
And that's maybe different from multi-ethnic because, I have I grew up in London. So that means that first and foremost, I come from a mixed culture. I was raised in a mixed culture. My family is itself a mixed culture. My marriage is also mixed. My living situation is mixed. All these things are really mixed. And so if I say, well, I come from a Bengali Muslim culture, I'm like, well, I also don't. I also don't. I joke about this all the time, but I never feel more English than when I'm interacting with an American. And suddenly I become like, Maggie Smith from Downton Abbey. And I'm like, oh, you disgusting provincial. It happens. It comes over me.
Americans have a way of bringing that out.
And I suddenly I'm like, oh my God. And I've never spoken like that in my life. And then suddenly I'm talking to someone from fucking El Paso. And I'm like, oh, I don't like it about myself. But multi-ethnic is like, yes, I am of, Bengali heritage. I come from a Muslim background. But my cultural identity is one that is defined by mixture and contact with other people.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I if you're from any of the major cities in the UK, shout out Birmingham, there are, how do you claim to grow up there and not interact with people of, I used to joke that I didn't know any British people when I was younger. And that was semi-true because, and this is a point I often like to make, as French people, we are insular. When they talk about like communities won't integrate, we don't integrate. We absolutely do not integrate.
It's like, do you want to come watch the ball? It's like, no, we're playing pétanque.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we like South Kensington is our fief. This is where we are, the boulangerie and the librairie and the school, and this is where we dominate. And you're very welcome to come to buy our pâtisserie, but only if you speak in French because hello. And we tend to be a community that, maintains our culture and our language very strongly, even when we move abroad. And I'll be honest with you, no one's telling us that's a problem. Curiously, I've so far not had any British people be to me like, as a French person, as British people, we would like to see you French people integrate more.
Which, considering you took Calais back from us, it's the least you could do.
It's offensive.
the least you could do. I mean, I want to move on just like a little bit because you had a podcast about whiteness, and the opening question that you would always ask is, "What is whiteness?" And so I want to play the Uno reverse back to you card. What is whiteness?
I mean, let me talk over all of my guests. Maybe I'll answer it this way and say, look, obviously different guests answered it differently. There were even some guests who refused to define it.
Really?
Yeah. Which I thought was really interesting. I think of whiteness as being a structure of domination that essentially structures our society in a way that creates a hierarchy of human value, and that value places white people at the top of it, and even within white people there are hierarchies, and it's what people of color come up against at every turn. So it's both invisible but deeply structuring and powerful of people's everyday realities. And I had my own kind of experience of, quote unquote, going through the looking glass of whiteness when...
If you weren't Muslim, I'd call it a come to Jesus moment. A come to Isa moment.
Yes.
It was a come to Isa moment.
Yes, both. Yes to both. I obviously wore hijab for most of my adult life. I was racialized by white people as other, which is going to be hilarious to people watching this who are like, are you telling me that white people looked at you and were like, you're not white? And the answer to that is yes. I was called the P word. I was called a sand N. I was called all kinds of racial slurs on a regular basis when I wore hijab, and I would experience very similar things that, racialized communities experience. And of course, with the caveat that different racialized communities experience that more or less. And I would say that, to be absolutely clear on this, people racialized as Black experience the hardest brunt of that in every single culture.
I mean, it's one of the things that, like, I cannot say this enough to people is that when you go out with a group of friends and you've got one or two Black people, right? That's one thing. When I've gone out with groups who are majority Black and I see how that majority Black group of people is being treated.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's like you've gone through a door into the Twilight Zone, and, it's not as if this is my first racism rodeo, right? But the intensity of it.
Absolutely. And that's now. Else. And that's now. We're talking about now, right?
Yeah.
Because for me, I would say now, I observe it in exactly the settings you've just described. And that's when my inner Karen goes wild, because I'm just like, I'm sorry, is this how you treat all your customers, or is it just the black ones? Because where this is ignite the Karen on steroids. When I'm in a situation where I know for a fact I would not be treated like that. Fact, I would not be treated like that. I feel very, I feel like it's a moral responsibility in that setting to wield my whiteness in the setting as a counter power to what's happening. Because implicit in the interaction is the hierarchy, is the notion that that's how these people behave. This is how we treat them.
It's not just in consumer settings. I mean, I remember going to a club night with a bunch of my friends, and it was 2 of us who were non-black people of color and 3 black people. So again, it's that like when it tips to like being a majority black group, and then how the crowd is treating you. Yeah. I mean, one of my friends, men just kept groping her. And it was the hypersexualization and the over-sexualization of a black woman's body and a black woman's curves. Like, it was insane. And I got into more physical fights on this one night than I had in my entire life. This was many years ago. Statute of limitations. You can't get me on it. But it was so... again, you think you know racism. And then racism's like, I've got this whole other wardrobe. There's this whole other... dimension.
Which is why I actually find whiteness quite an interesting term, because obviously it's the idea that whiteness as a structure of power excludes people and sometimes includes them, right? So Irish people were gradually integrated into whiteness.
How the Irish Became White, great book.
Exactly right. So, I'd say that's happening to some extent to Polish people as well, although it still hasn't fully happened. I think Polish people are on the border of that, which is that
play your cards right.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But there's still, they retain, there's something in the power dynamic that retains a sense of like, but if we choose to, you're Eastern European scum and you can go back to where you came from. And we know it's there and we know it's latent. And so, but whiteness as an exclusionary mechanism excludes different peoples in different ways that are rooted in the history of white Europeans' interactions with those different groups. And so I think because of the history of, slavery in particular, that the dehumanization that had to occur to justify what was done to Black people continues to bleed into the ways that many of us who are racialized as white may not even consciously recognize as being apparent. And so I say that in the sense that there are, of course, people who think of themselves as profoundly anti-racist and not racist who will replicate. And I wouldn't even say that I am not guilty of that myself, because I have blinkers. By virtue of my racial identity,
I'm gonna do a poke. Do a little poke, all right? Which is, if the position is that even if you're an anti-racist white person, you're always going to be a bit racist on some level. And whiteness, which is this thing that, yes, it's socially constructed, but you can't change it about yourself. Is there not something politically disempowering about it? We're sort of saying to not just white people, but to everyone, that there is a resilience or an invulnerability to racism.
Until proven to the contrary, that is the truth. That racism is, do you have a society in mind where it's not the case, that there is a structure of human value that places fairer skinned people at the top and darker skinned people at the bottom? Like, I don't have an example, sadly, so I have to deal with what I see. Everywhere I travel, from Malaysia to America to the Middle East, like, I, alhamdulillah, have traveled a lot in my life. In every single one of those settings, the people who are treated the worst are always Black.
So the first thing I'd say is that throughout other periods of human history, you have had systems of domination which is just not based on skin color at all.
Sure, I'm talking about, yes, right? Contemporaneously.
So the first thing I'd say is that, if we had to make racism, it also means that you can unmake racism as well.
Well, that's also a question. I think that's also a question. So can you, and we would explore this actually in the conversations I would have with some of these people, was, once you create these delineations, once you create these lines in the sand, and people also then start to build resistance to those lines in the sand in mirror of that, because, you know, if you're being oppressed on the basis of being Black, then that becomes who you are, right? You don't accept what you're being told you are, but that's the category that you're now working within. It's, you know, even down to the categories on our census. I mean, you can't, these categories are now there. Do we think that one day we're going to be able to like abolish them and say, you know, no one is ever again going to think of people along these categorizations? You know, I don't have an answer to that. All I'll say is my imagination is limited to be able to see how that would happen. I think what can happen is that the value and the hold of those categories can diminish. And I think that, to your question about it being disempowering, I actually don't agree. I think there's something empowering about recognizing where you stand within systems of power, because everything is power, everything is competing systems of power. And recognizing that not so much that it's immutable or personal, but that you are an active agent in either reproducing it or in contesting it.
So I agree. I think that latter point's really important, because I think that's the heart of all political agency, not just to do with anti-racism, but also to do with class politics, also to do with feminism, all of these other sort of, you know, fronts in political struggle as well. But I think that, one, we have to acknowledge that the nature of racism in global North societies has changed. I think there is a difference between slavery existing as a legal codified structure and the basis of our economy, and us having a system of structural racism and imperialism and all the rest of it. I think that there is a difference, and
of course,
I think that it does a damage and a disservice to the political struggles that have came before, to sort of be like, what? Well, we still have racism. It's like, yes, but like to not have slavery, I think big deal. But second thing is that I think that and there are interesting discussions around this, right? Spivak calls it operational essentialism, right? That we have these categories, we are forced to work within them operationally and strategically, but you know, that doesn't mean that we have to treat them as real.
Good luck with that.
I mean, she you know, there's a big old debate about like to what extent is it possible. You see a lot of essentialism, not a lot of operational.
There is a very strong trend in France of really racist white guys with Black wives. And
sure, there's also trends of misogynists being married to women. I mean, sure.
Right. So there's, you know, every category and permutation of, you know, I'm on the scale of racist to anti-racist exists. And so does their kind of management of that identity within a culture that continuously tells us it's wrong. And I think that there has been the development, certainly, of this idea that if I marry, you know, a person of color, that I'm somehow now absolved of my racism. That's
what I say all the time. I'm like, can't be racist against white people. Look.
Right. And I mean, to your point about the kind of negotiation of our identities as things that are either essential or instrumental, was that the word you were using?
Yeah, operational
or essential. I think that's particularly true for whiteness, because I definitely know whiteness is not an essential identity. Whiteness is a category that I exist in within this society, and I resist that. But I also benefit from it. So it's a really difficult one for me to say, oh, I'm kind of operationally, you know, distant from it, when it's like, well, also I move through the world as a white woman who, if there's an issue and I scream, 10 people will come. Right? That like, it's just a reality. There's a different way that like I can try and distance myself ideologically from the category, but I move through the world in a way that category filters my experience and other people's experience of me.
Absolutely. And that's, I'm not a liberal, right? I'm not a liberal.
Me neither.
I'm not a liberal. So I don't, you know, I agree with you that you can't just imagine yourself out of the category. But I suppose one of the things I'm really interested in, and a piece of political history I'm really interested in, is the Black Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah.
And the work that they did, not just with, you know, Puerto Ricans, young poor white people from Appalachia, but also with the Viet Cong. There was some famous sort of summits between the Black Panthers and the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong said, you are Black Panthers, we are Yellow Panthers, and joined them in the burning of the draft cards. And I suppose when we're making this argument about show me a society where, dark-skinned people, black people aren't, always at the bottom of it. Well, I'd also say, well, it depends on context, right? So there you're talking about a situation in the 60s and 70s during the Vietnam War where the blackness of the Black Panthers is what gives them a vantage point and forms the sort of the core of their anti-imperialism and their communism as well. But it would sort of be, it would be really alien, and to take what we do today, which would be to sort of say, okay, if we're going to stand in solidarity with you, the Vietnamese people who are currently being subject to American aggression and imperialism, you have to abjure yourselves of your anti-blackness first. Or you have to admit the anti-blackness in your society before we can get moving on this. That's kind of what we do today. That's not what they did back then. So the Americanness of being, sorry, just to interrupt, but the Americanness also wouldn't disappear from the equation.
Yeah, so there's many things there. One of it obviously is the replicating in the forms of social organization of the categories of oppression, right? So black people with black people, yellow people with yellow, white people with white people, which I also observe in terms of our conversation just now about sort of the essentialism. Like once those categories are created, once they're the locus of your oppression, they then also become the category through which you resist or not. Open question. As a Muslim, I guess I'm a little bit suspicious of the notion of organization along racial lines, because to me, racial lines are aleatory in essence, and I'm much I'm someone who believes in organization around ideals and principles and things that are at a sort of metaphysical or ideological level. I understand that race, having been politicized, translates into ideological positions, but the question of whether that should then be the basis for social organization, that's not for me to say as a white woman in the conversation. I will never answer that question.
Why
I will not. I will not. But I will say...
I want to draw white people on this shit more often. No, I do. I really do. Because I think part of it is I sometimes feel frustrated when I hear someone go, oh, but I don't want to step there because I'm a man or because I'm white or whatever. I'm like, okay, but then what's happened is that we have a political relationship, right? I would call it comradeship. We're comrades together in a struggle. And when you go, oh, but I can't go there, I feel that as an inhibiting force on a political discussion and relationship.
I guess what I'm saying is I can't tell people of color, and I wouldn't want to tell people of color how to organize against their own oppression. And I think that it would be misplaced of me because of my subjectivity to do that. However, when I'm speaking with my friends, do I say I get, because I have a lot of friends who I guess are invested in political blackness, and I'm very critical openly of black capitalism because that's a fairly easy shot for me to take. I just don't understand why you think you're going to be the exception to the rule. And I'm sad that you've drunk the Kool-Aid that makes you think
who
that
wants
it's
to be the exception?
Many people. Our entire social media culture is based on the idea that you're going to be the billionaire, you're going to be the crypto king, you're going to be, like, especially male culture online is really based on the idea. They play a lot on this kind of competitiveness that we that men have around, like we have it too, but it's very much pushed as a male thing. Of like, you're going to be the ones, you're going to get up at 4 a.m. and you're going to work until 3 a.m. and then you're going to like drink this protein smoothie and then you're going to go out there and you're going to get all these women and you're going to get this job.
It's the American psycho lifestyle.
It's an American psycho lifestyle, but it's now normalized as aspirational. And I think it's obviously been deliberately normalized as aspirational, because when you start to see obviously the interconnectedness of the people who control our social media platforms with those in political power, there's definitely a kind of shared interest in driving this notion that lifestyle is aspirational, as opposed to, I don't know, do we need billionaires? Maybe we just need like all of us to have a little bit more money, maybe a little bit of land, be able to afford a family. I sense that might make us all a little bit happier than just like a couple of you absolute dickheads, becoming billionaires. But what do I know? But so to connect that back to what we were saying, I in my conversation with my friends on political blackness, and I've had many of these. If anyone wants to go back to these conversations, there's a conversation with one of my favorite is with someone who is a very good friend of mine called Bina Salami, who is a Finnish Nigerian philosopher. And she talked to me about the notion of blackness beyond the notion of blackness that evolved through slavery. The idea that there was a conception of blackness that existed in Africa before this, and that, there is something in that idea of blackness as a form of political organization that united Africans beyond the boundaries and beyond tribes and beyond these boundaries that have been created, that is powerful. And that I am much more, okay, that I could kind of hear that. The notion of political blackness, where it's like the specific identity that's been foisted upon you in the context of racism in this country, becomes the basis for organizing the resistance. I understand that is where we are. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me personally, because I like the idea of us saying, understanding what that category has created in terms of inequality, but in terms of how we resist that, I wonder whether there is an imaginary place beyond it where we all meet. And again, I'm being an idealist and I'm also not experiencing it firsthand. So it could well be disconnected from people's day-to-day realities. And that's an important caveat, is that I think there might be a space beyond that. And again, as a Muslim, I think there is a space beyond that, because our faith is multi-ethnic, multiracial, and really what unifies us are a set of ideas about the world. And within a Muslim context, obviously there are replications of the hierarchies that exist within our society, but there is also very much a recognition that, a Black African scholar could be, one of the most esteemed intellectuals or references, by virtue of his knowledge, or her knowledge, I should say. And so, yeah, I'm more so driven by the idea that our organization has to be rooted. And that's why I really actually enjoyed your critique of identity politics, because, I could never have made it publicly, because I don't think it's appropriate for me, through my racial identity, to be making that critique of identity politics. But I thought it was good that it was there, because it's something I felt for a long time, that in a space, if I express a critique of the way that we're organizing politically as people resisting a system of exploitation that benefits from racism, that critique can be undermined primarily through my racial identity. And similarly, that it would then constitute forms of organization that I would be excluded from on the basis of my racial identity, even if I share the ideological objectives of the organization.
Well, look, I think we have to we've got to wrap it up here, because otherwise this could go on forever. I think we should do a part 2 one day. I would love to do
I'd love to do a part 2.
I would love to do episode 2. Myriam François, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thanks for having me.